Do you think you can reason universally ever? Nice, easy question for a Monday afternoon.
Go ahead.
Because what I've read from this paper, it's like Ricker wants to us to be more reflective, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we want to understand something, or like language, for example, so we need to understand life. So that's why, like, universality and historicity cannot be separated. So that's why always produce new meaning because of reflection itself.
Yeah, excellent. That's really good. Yeah, it's one reason actually why one of the big influences Ricoeur's had in theology has been about reflexivity and reflection. So part of my work is in the area of practical theology, people who are thinking about practices, and there Ricoeur is an interesting and important background character because of this insistence that reflection is never completed. So yeah, I think that's spot on. Very good.
Yeah, because his argument that attract me is, in order to understand, you must believe. And if I to be forgot, you have to understand. Between understand and believe, I think. Yeah. If you want to believe, you have to understand, and you have to understand. You must believe.
Yeah.
Like circular.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I had here on the. Yeah. Brilliant. Well observed. That's from a totally different essay, but you've got it from just these two. So that, I think that's a super reading. Forgive the picture. That's the Ferris wheel that's in the square in Birmingham at the moment. I was looking for a wheel and I've been there. So yeah, the famous circle of believing in order to understand and understanding in order to believe, that could just collapse into self-reference, right? Into a vicious circle where the believer just affirms their own interpretation, right? What saves that, Ricoeur suggests, is this idea of the new way of looking, the possibility of a new interpretation, recognizing that the symbol is opaque, meaning you can't see right through it. There's always more. There's always more to understand. So there's a kind of humility, I think, in that approach. But yeah, he himself recognizes that he is standing in that circle. He's made this assumption, he's made this wager that that's worth doing. Yeah.
But you're saying this is like a circular argument, is that like basically which puts down this concept? But in reality, I mean, like if you look at Wittgenstein, he's basically saying everything is like a game, so you need to be part of the game to understand it properly. So it's like essential to understand. You actually need to believe in that system or be part of that system to understand it properly. And by doing so, then you come to the right belief, if you like, from that system. So, yeah,
I think that's exactly right. I think the connection with Wittgenstein is very well taken. Similar sorts of concerns, slightly different questions, but I think that's spot on. So Ricoeur's claim is that the circular doesn't have to be vicious, right? So it doesn't have to be, exactly. But the test of that is, are you getting out of that circle of interpretation, of belief and understanding? Are you getting out of that something that's really fruitful for trying to describe or attend to lived human experience or the nature of reality? So the fruit is in, does it help you write good philosophy? It becomes vicious if it ends up in authoritarian kind of doctrine. That's his worry. You might find it quite interesting, I think, to look if you are interested in this methodological question, you might find it interesting to look at the very first of his big systematic books, The Voluntary and the Involuntary, because that's before he makes this hermeneutical turn. So it's one of the places in which he's very deliberately doing this, trying to philosophize without assumptions, or to make clear where he's making assumptions. And it seems to me that the assumptions he's making, following Asprey's argument, is about the possibility of original goodness. It's this Kantian horizon. Asprey wants to read that theologically, and I don't think one can necessarily. But that in the voluntary and the involuntary, he's still hopeful. He's still got this, the possibility of goodness, the possibility of the good, of the voluntary being good.
Is that talking about like free will and predestination, or is that something really different? Because that's what I first wrote when you mentioned the title.
Yeah, it's a natural resting point. No, it's not a religious question for him.
Oh, okay.
It's about, is the human being really free, regardless of the religious context. So what is going on with the human person when so much of what is true about the human person is given, that it's involuntary? I'm from a particular place, I'm from a particular time, that means something to me. Can I still say I'm free when I'm also contingent?
Surely the answer is yes.
Yeah, unsurprisingly, his answer is also yes. But he is interested in the way in which the involuntary becomes part of ethical questions.
Yeah.
So bear in mind, he's writing this in the 50s. You know, things like the Nuremberg trials are going on, attention to the atrocities of the mid part of the 20th century. You know, but this comes out significantly in Hannah Arendt's work on the banality of evil, the Eichmann trials. I don't know if you've seen some of that writing, where there was a profound thoughtlessness, an unwilled character to the actions that were being taken by people within the National Socialist machine. So you've got an involuntary quality to those actions, because they weren't willing them in any meaningful way. They weren't really thinking about them, and yet they've done them, and they do get prosecuted for them. Ideally, they get prosecuted for them. So that's part of his challenge, is there an inevitability about humans choosing the wrong thing? Is it to do with human thoughtlessness? And what's interesting is that his philosophy is trying to think about that before we get to the level of concrete power. This is why Kant is so important to him. He's trying to think about the conditions of possibility rather than the actual concrete experiences. So he doesn't talk about Eichmann. Instead, he will talk about what is involuntary and what is voluntary in the human person, in the human will. And that is insufficient for him, right? It's the first book of a trilogy that he never finishes. So the provisionality of even the phenomenological question about what the will is turns then to an account of what it means to be both finite versus culpable, which in Christian theology sometimes get conflated, but are in fact distinct features. And so he ends up talking about, the fallible human person, the human person who is both finite and fallible, and then the turn to the symbol, which is how he gets access to what humans think evil might be in the first place, or how they have made sense of evil, not that they've thought it. That is exactly the wrong word, as we shall see. Does that make sense though? Like, is that a coherent philosophical question? I guess is important to. Cool. Is there anything else that we want to pull out of the Hope and the Structure of Philosophical Systems text? Anything that didn't make sense that you would like to check out? Anything that you would like to comment on? Okay. Last bit of context then, so you know where that's come from. Hope and the Structure of Philosophical Systems appears in a book called Figuring the Sacred, This is an after-the-fact collection. Mark Wallace, who's the editor, has come along and brought various essays together that are interested in the interface with religion. So if that is something you remain interested in, given the conversation we've had today, that's quite a good collection to go and have a look at. There's quite a few essays in there that are about the disciplinary distinction, and some that are about the listening to the biblical text thing. So I would particularly recommend Naming God in that essay collection, Naming God, because that's where he says, I am a listener before the biblical text, and this is what I think I'm listening to. If you're ultimately most interested in biblical interpretation, you will need to look at the essays in biblical interpretation. I'm afraid I have that book out from the library. It's going back later today. Cool. I will just comment really briefly on the last 2 slides, just to make sure that we're happy with where we've got to. So hope in this essay is an approximation. So even the word hope doesn't mean some particular thing or some particular defined concept. It's always this guess, this horizon. And the idea is that hoping is making possible some particular philosophical project, some possible reasoning. So ending the philosophical discourse in a way that both breaks a closure and opens a horizon. In the Christian sense, that's existential again, right? It's life in the face of death. Not only life after death, but the possibility of choosing the good, always. And for Kant, the possibility of originary goodness it's another claim. It's this unfulfilled claim, but it's a claim nevertheless. It's why Hegel is ultimately unsuccessful, because he doesn't have that hope. Oh, there is another essay on hope, which is called Freedom in the Light of Hope, in which he talks about that. I just really love this quotation. Freedom is the capacity to live according to the paradoxical law of superabundance. It doesn't make any sense to deny the possibility of death, right? If you're just doing rational work, that wouldn't make any sense. But that is characteristic ultimately of his philosophy, of this possibility of goodness, the possibility of sense, the possibility of making sense of a particular philosophical question. That is the very content of hope. If you did want to read more about hope, the essay Freedom in the Light of Hope is in the collection The Conflict of Interpretations. It's another collection from this period. We can leave our PowerPoint now, and I will therefore end that recording because we haven't used it. That was just my intro, so that will get uploaded now and be. I think no one's used it before. There's this tab Panopto on your canvas. Some of your other modules might use it. Yeah. It's extremely funny to me that the recording system is called Panopto. It's very Foucaultian. You can see that's from today. It's processing. It will be there in a minute. It's saying 1 hour and 7. It'll actually be about half an hour. Don't promise. It hasn't recorded your conversation. Although your conversation was excellent, so you can feel very happy about that. Right, the rest of the time, we're going to get to symbolism of evil. It's about 2:15. Shall we just go straight through, or would you like to stretch your legs, have a comfort break? Break? Okay, yeah. Cool. You're doing really well, guys. It's 2:15. Let's start again at 20 past, okay? So we can take 5 minutes. And those who haven't fully read the text can get familiar with it. I think that's always important to acknowledge. It might be the case. Okay. Good. I'm going to use this chance to get a drink, guys, because I don't think my voice is going to hold out much longer. So I will be right back. Feel free to get up and wander around if you need to. Okay. On then to the symbolism of evil. Brief reminder, this is the second part of the second book of his project about the will. The next thing was supposed to be poetics of the will. He never wrote it, he never got to it. That sort of makes sense. Had you systematise the poetics, that's very tricky. What he does go on to do instead is pay attention to metaphor, and from there narrative, from there the self, from there ethics and justice. What I've had you read from this book is just the introduction and the conclusion. So you haven't really seen Ricoeur actually handling symbols. You've just got what he thinks symbols are and how they work. So effectively what you've had is some remarks about his methodology, his methodological approach. That may work for you or not. So if there's anything here that appears to be a reference to something that you don't understand, that's probably quite a good place to begin. I'll also note that in the introduction, the criteriology of symbols, that middle section, is probably less useful to you ultimately than the beginning and end of the introduction, where he's talking about contingency and the reenactment. So don't panic if there were bits of this that did not work for you at all. He's relating to a larger project that you haven't had a chance to get familiar with. and we shouldn't attempt to do in the few minutes we have here. But that's what you've got: intro, conclusion, methodological remarks about how he wants to treat symbol. So that brings us to our second set of structural questions. Again, as ever, I'm very, very happy to pay attention to other questions. We've sort of touched on this already implicitly, if not otherwise. But we can start with the first question. Why does Ricoeur make this turn to symbol and to myth, in your view? What is his philosophical reason for that?
I don't know the true answer, but in his writing, he always mentioned that because of myth and symbol, he could understand anything, because he cannot interpret something without something that happened in the past. Like he mentioned about the Greek or Jerusalem or Hebrew myth. So that's, yeah, of course he said that myth and symbols can be good exploration for him. Besides, why his don't consider myth and symbol? Because the need to discuss the philosophic locus to speak of this reenactment no longer religious experience and is not yet a philosophy. That's what I found from
from the text.
from the text.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a difference between a symbol and philosophy. Philosophy is trying to do reasoning work. A symbol isn't doing that yet. But what a symbol might do, or the myth that humanity has been telling itself, a particular part of humanity has been telling itself, what that story might bear symbolically, is a way of getting at an ultimate concern. So, for example, no, let's not use an example. The symbol is something spoken, right? He keeps using this word utterance, and this is important for him. He's a very language-focused philosopher. Something's been brought to language. It has communicable meaning. It can be communicated. But the symbol, it's not clear what is being communicated. If I say to you, do we have enough chairs in the room? You know what I mean by a chair. It's physically these objects. We've got enough chairs, great, we can have a class where everyone's comfortable. If I use the word chair without useful context, it might become a metaphor. A chair might be the literal chair, or it might be a position in a university. We talk about being the chair of philosophy. Now that evokes a literal chair, but it's a metaphor. So anything that is poetic language has meaning beyond itself, has a hidden meaning. It's opaque. And any myth is already playing with that. So it isn't an explanation, right, in the way that a teaching or a philosophy might be attempting. Instead, it's exploratory. That's its term. Why is it useful to Ricoeur to pay attention to such explorations? Ricoeur is making a wager here again, right? He's making a bet. The bet is these are stories that tell us something about how humanity has understood itself. The myth isn't fiction. It's not a literal explanation. It's not a history, but it isn't completely fictive either. It's a reflection on humanity's existence. It's an attempt at making sense of where humanity is. And Ricoeur's approach here is not to say this is a true history or to say this is true in that sense. Rather, he wants to treat it as, I'm quoting from page 5, a traditional narration which relates to events that happened at the beginning of time, not necessarily describing such events, but relates to events that happened at the beginning of time, and which has the purpose of providing grounds for the ritual actions of men of today, and in a general manner, establishing all the forms of action and thought by which man understands himself in his world. I will just note that in the French, this carries a less gendered connotation. In English, you tend to get man, he, himself. It feels less accessible. That's how it's been translated. So bear with us there. Now, in this particular book, he's paying attention to myths and symbols to do with evil. That's what he's trying to get at. It's the symbolism of evil. The clue is in the title, because this is where, continuing on, this is humanity's way of understanding what it means to be entrapped in evil, both in terms of one's own choices and sort of the evil outside. So one of the first stories that he turns to in the book, for example, is that Genesis story that I was mentioning. So for those who don't know it, God has created humanity, they're in paradise. He says there's only one rule, don't eat the fruit of a particular tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And Adam and Eve, the first sort of humans, are there in the garden, paradise, very happy. And a snake comes up to Eve and says, you should eat that fruit. It's really good. You'll have knowledge of good and evil. You'll be like a god. And Eve, after some conversation, eats the fruit and gives it to Adam, and he eats the fruit, and then they're expelled from paradise. And this is a really interesting myth, because what Christianity does with that is turn it into the doctrine of original sin, right? This originating moment of disobedience. But the evil's already there in the garden. It's there in the snake. So there is more in the symbol, or more in the myth, than the doctrine quite accounts for on its own. And Christianity has done lots of different things with that. It's talked about the devil and all sorts of other kind of theological constructions. But it's a story about evil already being there and also being something that's chosen by the human person. So the voluntary and involuntary categories haven't gone away here, actually. What we are entangled in and what we choose for ourselves is always this constant sort of back and forth. Now, that's only one of the symbols that he looks at, but that's an example of what I mean when I say the story means more than itself. You can go in very different philosophical or theological directions from that story, depending on which bit you're emphasizing. What Ricoeur is trying to do is get at the symbol underneath the myth, which we might think of as kind of the most simple unit of meaning. That might be a way of thinking about it. And for him, that comes back constantly to defilement, as something that's happened from the outside, something that's stained. Sin, the disobedience, the moment of infraction, and then guilt, the aftermath. And that shapes the whole rest of the book in terms of the content. So that's why these are terms that keep showing up in the intro, right? Because he's sort of heralding what's about to come up in the book. So on page 8, down at the very bottom of the page, at the start of a new paragraph, this is what he thinks is going on with symbols in relation to those things I've just been talking about. Man's living experience of fault gives itself a language that expresses it in spite of its blind character, so you can't really see what it's getting at, and yet you're getting something out of it. A language that makes explicit its contradictions and its internal revolutions through expression in a myth. A language, finally, that reveals the experience of alienation as astonishing. So this is about sin, that alienation point, oneself and yet not oneself, making choices yet not making choices. That's what he thinks symbol and myth is. It's pretty, I think it's a very significant expression methodologically. That's how he thinks language itself is actually operating. Is there anything else that you wanted to ask questions about with respect to why he's making this turn to symbol or myth?
I have a question. We are now talking about symbol and previously about a little bit about religious text. Do you think that symbol and text are same, or symbol can be a text or language that is it different or same?
That's a really good question. A text is a medium for symbol. It tells a story, and hidden in the story is some symbolic meaning. Whether a text itself can carry symbolic weight both yes and no. A text can carry meaning beyond itself. So, for example, religious cultures where the book itself is sacred, you do not want the book to come to damage, for example. It's carrying meaning beyond the literal reality of it being a book. A good example might be the focus in Islam on the Quran having never changed, right? That it's always repeated in exactly and precisely the same way. That has symbolic weight. That is not a symbol in the sense that recur means it. I don't think, but you could argue against that, right? This is me arguing. I think it's not a symbol because the symbol is this most basic unit of meaning. So you'd have to think about what the symbol is there. If the idea that is being explored is the perfect communication of God, for example, what's the symbol, right? That's the thing. Okay. What's the actual symbol? In the same way that the Genesis story isn't the doctrine of original sin, but rather defilement and sin and guilt at the same time. Yeah. So that's the layer you'd have to try to get to if you wanted to argue that the book itself is a symbol in that sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because after you answered the question, so I have another question, which is, Ricker also said in page 349, I think, that symbol must be allegory. But he also explained if the symbol is not allegory, but I don't understand from his explanation if symbol is not allegory. So do you think that symbol must be allegory if you want to focus on something to discuss or to research?
think for Ricoeur, symbol has to be allegory, but that isn't the only way of seeking to understand human existence. It is a detour to go through the symbol. He's making a move, like it's not taking the straightest path, he's taking the winding path through these myths. So for symbol to be meaningful, it has to be allegory. It has to connect to experience. It has to be phenomenological in that sense. But that isn't the only way of philosophizing. He's making a claim here that it's good and useful to go through symbol. You don't have to, I think. Does that help?
So you mean basically we have to focus on symbol at first before we interpret or we focus on it?
You don't have to. You don't have to. This is Ricoeur saying, here's what I am attempting. I am going to pay attention to symbols of evil because I think they reveal something existential about humanity's condition. That evil is already there and yet also chosen by the human person. So he thinks that the symbols are revealing of something that's present otherwise in an unspoken way in human existence. But as evidenced by his other books, he hasn't started there. It's a turn he makes partway through, actually, that project. So you don't have to start with symbol. You can do philosophy in other ways. If you're going to pay attention to symbol, then it means a detour. It means spending time with a culturally distinct set of stories and images to see what that cultural heritage tells you before turning that into a philosophical question that you can consider now with greater richness. So the symbol doesn't give the philosophy. This is the phrase he keeps using in the conclusion. Rather, it gives rise to thought. Okay. And now you've got to go and do your philosophy as well. But you don't have to do it that way. You could just philosophize. He's making a wager. He's making a bet that this is useful.
So for him, basically the whole biblical text or the whole text is all symbolism. It's not, there's no reality to it, as in this story didn't happen, nothing happened. It's just, it's all the human experience, if you like, trying to understand certain concepts, or it's a symbol or allegory, if you like, allegorical, to make us understand. So there was no creation story in 6 days and things like that. It just means, it's a matter of time. Things take time to be created, like that kind of thing. That's what he's...
That is broadly the case, especially when he's talking about the Hebrew canon, because these are what he called myths. Not to say that they are completely made up. They relate to events in history. They're an attempt to describe something, but what they're describing is out of human memory, if that makes sense. So it's not that they're not fictional. They're something more complex than that. However, I do think he treats the Greek New Testament in a different way, because he himself is Christian, and so he sees those stories and those reflections. How would I describe it? It's another wager, right? He's wagering that they say something about historical events that can be made meaningful. So it's not too different from the Hebrew canon, I don't think, but it is a more personal wager for him about Christian commitment to Jesus as a figure who promises the horizon of hope that we've been talking about. So I think one could embark on a very interesting project of how Ricoeur treats the Hebrew Bible and how he treats the New Testament in slightly different ways. And I really recommend that essay again, Naming God, because in that text he talks about different genres in the biblical canon. Some are history, some are law, some are prophetic. There's wisdom literature. But history is part of it. And so he relates each of these genres as something that helps make sense of the others in a whole. So it's not symbol at that point, it's genre and text and sort of beyond this basic unit of meaning. But I think that's quite revealing of how he thinks different texts are contributing to the book that believers are gathering around. Yeah, that's a lovely question. I want to think about it for longer to work out if what I've said is absolutely spot on. But yeah, he definitely doesn't think, right, there's a literal reading of this that's worth paying attention to. That's not interesting for him, ultimately. What's interesting is, what does this say about humanity? And thus, he treats it symbolically and allegorically.
Would you say nowadays, like, the majority, I'm not using the word majority, but majority probably would look at the Old Testament, at least in that kind of framework, as in it's all symbolic, as in like God is wrestling with Jacob or something like this, you know. This is like a struggle, or I don't know, you could symbolize it in different ways, but I mean, it's not a literal. Does anyone actually see that as a literal thing nowadays? Or?
I mean, there are fundamentalists, as there are in any religious tradition. So there are literal readers of the Bible. They are understood by everyone else to be extremist expressions of Christianity. But for example, there are in the US, there's a movement around creationism who want to understand creation as a literal act by God that is consequently contradictory to things like evolution or the Big Bang or so on. So it's there and it's present and it's surprisingly vocal in some parts of the world. It's not a usual mainstream understanding. And I think you're right that usually the treatment is these are ways of thinking about the world that are valuable and important. Does that help?
Yeah.
Good.
The article on naming God, can you put that up by any chance? Or is it
I don't have a copy of the book.
Oh, is it a book? Okay.
Yeah, so Figuring the Sacred is the book, and Naming God is one of the essays in that book, and I don't have Figuring the Sacred.
Okay.
I happened to have a copy of the Structure of Philosophical Systems, and not of Naming God.
So it's Figuring the Sacred.
Yeah, that's the book, and the essay is Naming God. I'm sure I must have scanned it at some point, so if I can find it in my records, I will put it up.
Thank you.
But you may have to track it down, I'm afraid.
What's the influence of Rick Kors? And I know he's written a lot.
Yeah.
But as in, how influential is his work to others? And just did everyone kind of start taking from him and start changing their own views and their own like interpretations of the text now? Like,
this is a really good question. I mentioned at the beginning that in English-speaking contexts, people only tend to get little pieces of the Ricoeur stuff. So you will find in theological context that it's his biblical interpretation stuff that shows up. But actually that's a tiny fraction of the whole, and understanding his larger philosophical project about being provisional and being hopeful and so on makes a big difference to understanding what he's doing with the biblical piece. So in the English-speaking realm, he's had a bit of an influence in biblical interpretation places, usually where someone is already quite keen on Karl Barth. That's the sort of tradition that he tends to have been influential in. When he was at Chicago, there was a big biblical interpretation argument going on between the Yale and the Chicago schools. So Hauerwas and some other thinkers at Yale were significant for that. But I think that's really petered off now. I don't think it hasn't had staying power beyond that generation. Otherwise, in English-speaking realms, he is not that well known. It is more in French and in lots of other international contexts. So it's more about him as a global thinker, actually. So if you look to the bibliography, one of the reasons it's so long is because it also includes stuff that's in translation. I'm going to try and find the contents page now. Yeah. So you've got primary bibliography, his books have been translated into 33 different languages. Many of them are European, but also into Chinese, into Korean, into Arabic, Vietnamese, Turkish, Macedonian, and Persian. So his reach is difficult to judge as a consequence, right? It has gone to very many networks, and different philosophical discourses and moments have used him in different ways. So my encounter with him, for example, is very much in his ethics work, the self and the other and the institution and how we are entangled together. But it relies on this understanding that symbol is important in the first place, right? That narrative carries meaning, it carries values that are hidden away. So I think it is a problem that in the English-speaking world, people only know pieces of his work. I think it is a reductive thing, which is why I tend to use these two essays, because they say something structural, they say something methodological about the kind of work he is attempting.
But then even taking that like little part of his work, that's still something, isn't he? He's still advancing this kind of genre and how to look at things and how to interpret text, let's say.
Yeah, I think so. I think they're really powerful sections of his work in their own right, in that sense. And yeah, the hermeneutic project continues. It's probably had more influence in German thinking than anywhere else. So colleagues who have been on the European Ethics Group, for example, who advise the European Council, have been Ricoeur scholars. Hiller Harker, that's Haker, is such a colleague. So yeah, it has spreading influence. In France, his influence came very much more towards the end of his life because of this disruptive period in the late 60s, and when people were saying, oh, he's a crypto-theologian rather than a real philosopher. And he's had a lot of influence in that context in the Institutes of Justice. He did quite a lot of public lecturing there, for example. So it's in very different kinds of pockets.
How did he write so much?
I know. The last book that was published from Ricoeur was published posthumously, and it's called Vivant jusqu'à la mort, which means writing up to death. And he's writing while he's dying. Like, it's just extraordinary. He's extraordinary. He's an amazing person. But he's an interesting person to encounter in continental thought, right? Because he's critiquing a lot of the threads that you have encountered. He has a particular position on Hegel, particular position on Kant, and he's introducing questions that pay attention to what is philosophy versus what is religion and how the two can relate. And is doing something, I think, that is fundamentally modern through a period in which postmodernity is getting off the ground. So in that sense, he's almost old-fashioned in his generation, and he's only now really being retrieved. It's interesting because there are some other immediately post-war thinkers who are being retrieved philosophically. Arendt is becoming significant again. Simone Weil is becoming significant again. So there's something going on right now with our urgent philosophical questions that seem to match the concerns of the 1950s and 60s. So perhaps you will find Ricoeur helpful as you continue in your careers. Perhaps not. This might be your one meeting with him. That's okay too. We have come to the end of our time. Just to reassure you guys, there is just no code for attendance. I don't know why it isn't on the system. That won't show up as non-attendance. It will just show up as not a thing. So yeah, no problems there. Go ahead.
I just want to let you know that probably yesterday I've sent you an email regarding...
Oh, yeah, lovely. That's great. I've got a little draft suggesting some things to think about, and we can have a conversation about it maybe. What's your timeline for the proposal though? Because it has to be submitted, doesn't it?
Yeah, the deadline of the proposal is in the end of this month, but regarding the supervisor,
it's the 8th of
December.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I will send that today then, so you'll be a little bit further informed.
Thank you.
Very cool. If other questions occur, especially if you want to write an assignment, my office hours are on the PTR Education Hub. And they're also on my office door. One is online, one is in person. Feel free to come and ask me questions. Feel free to email me. I'll be glad to talk about it. But yeah,
Thank you.
otherwise,
Thank you.
I think you're back with David next week.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.